Welcome back to Saim, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about the Saim Hann and the Iyanden Craftworlds and where they stand in Arks of Omen. So I've already done videos on Craftworld Uthway, I've done videos on Iyanden, and I wanted to cover Saim Hann and Iyanden because they're kind of the Craftworlds that get the short end of the stick typically since the release of the 9th edition Eldar Codex. And that's because these Craftworlds are typically overshadowed by the other ones, and especially overshadowed by the far-flung Craftworld traits, many of which just straight up are better than the bonuses that these Craftworlds give you. So today we're going to be talking about the Lost Craftworlds, Saim Hann, and Iyanden, and talking about whether or not they're good enough to play in Arks of Omen. And honestly, between you and me, you guys, I do think they're actually pretty decent. They're not as good as the other Craftworlds, but you can definitely make them work if you're a big fan of them. So, quick overview before we start the video today. We're going to be looking at the army abilities, relics, stratagems, and warlord traits of the Saim Hann and Iyanden Craftworlds. We're going to be looking at what units work best with each Craftworld. And we're going to be talking about why these two Craftworlds are not performing anywhere close to the others in Arks of Omen. And I do think it is because of a couple of reasons, not a lot of reasons, but just a couple that just set them back a bit when talking about their competitive viability. And we're also going to be going into how to build a successful and strong list with each Craftworld and an example list for each. Because to be honest with you guys, I do have a soft spot for both of these Craftworlds. I have played them both in this edition, and I really do like them. I like them from a lore perspective. You know, I've been playing this game for a very long time, since basically the end of 2nd edition when I was just a kid. And I really think the lore of these Craftworlds is really cool, and they've basically been around for a long time, almost since the beginning. I know that Saim Hann was one of the oldest Craftworlds, and I know that because, you know, I did have a copy of the 2nd edition book when I was a kid, and I remember looking at all the cool Saim Hann colored models and thinking that was so awesome. So anyway, so let's jump right into it. Let's go ahead and talk about Iyanden and of course the Saim Hann. All right, so starting with Iyanden and their army bonus. So this is kind of where we get into the point where we're starting to see why Iyanden isn't such a great Craftworld competitively. So if we look at their army bonus, they basically have mini armor of contempt, but it's only against AP -1 and 2 weapons. And I think this really limits Iyanden because Iyanden is kind of supposed to be that Craftworld that's really good with the Wraith units, right? And unfortunately, having a mini armor of contempt just really isn't that great on a lot of Wraith units. So as far as toughness goes, if your opponent is shooting at your Wraith Guard and stuff like that, they're probably going to be aiming weapons that are quite a bit better than AP -1 or AP -2. But even against those targets, if you're running things like Wraith Blades, for example, even something that has AP -2 is going to bring Wraith Guard to a 4+ invul save anyway. So it doesn't have a lot of effect. Basically, if you think about it, on the most effective Wraith unit, which is Wraith Blades with Ghost Axes and Force Shields, the only type of weapons that this actually helps them with are AP -1 weapons. So again, AP -1 weapons are just not going to be that effective anyway against Wraith Guard and Wraith Blades for that matter. So the mini armor of contempt bonus is really just not that great. Now, the other part of this is much worse. Now, the other part of this basically makes combat attrition tests a little bit better. It gives you a +1 to combat attrition tests. That means if you fail a morale check, you're going to get +1 to your result. So instead of losing a model on a 1 or a 2, you're going to lose a model on just a 1. And while that doesn't sound bad, when you're talking about Wraith units, they have leadership 10 and they're typically taken in squads of 5. They're really never going to be in a position to fail a morale check, rarely if ever. So if they do fail, they will be failing on a 6, and that's only if they've lost 4 models in the unit. And at that point, you're still going to lose that last model. So it's really useless on units of 5, and it only really comes into play on bigger units. So this is really something that would be better on a Guardian unit, maybe of 20 or something like that, if they lose like 8 Guardians that turn, for example. this could be kind of useful for saving a few more guardians, but in general, it's just not that great of a trait. As for the Iyanden relic, they have the Citronome of Iyanden, which is actually really good. And this is a really good relic, and it's a shame that Iyanden doesn't have better army abilities, because if they did, I think this would be a really good option to take. So I love this relic personally because it gives Wraith Blades more attacks, which is awesome, right? One of the weaknesses of Wraith Blades is not having enough attacks to punch through multiple targets or, other tough targets just like they are. So like Terminators, stuff like that. But it also gives Wraithguard battle focus, which is really cool because this allows Wraithguard to basically act as aspect warriors, basically shooting and then ducking behind cover. So it's a really good way of, preserving a unit of Wraithguard, which, by the way, because their Wraith cannons basically have a greater range now, you can more easily make good use out of this. And the other cool thing about this is that because it lasts until the end of the next command phase, that means that Wraith units can also benefit from matchless agility. So if you don't get a good battle focus roll, you can pay a command point and re-roll that dice. So pretty useful overall, and I think a really good relic to have if you are running Iyanden. As for the Warlord trait, though, this is another thing that is a little bit weak. I think this one is probably one of the weaker Warlord traits in the Codex, and basically what it does is it essentially gives fortune for your Warlord or character. So this doesn't sound bad on paper, but when you realize how squishy Eldar characters are, something like having fortune on one doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, right? It makes a whole lot of sense on things like the Avatar of Cain and stuff, but because the Avatar of Cain can't take a Warlord trait, this is really just not that useful. And we also have the Iyanden stratagem, which is Guided Wraith Sight. Basically, it requires a Spirit Seer, but it allows your Spirit Mark ability to have an unlimited range for a single unit of Wraiths. So that's pretty decent, although the Spirit Mark ability itself isn't that great to begin with. It only allows you to reroll ones to wound, which is good on some stuff, right? And the cool thing about this is that it doesn't specify just Wraithguard. So you could use this on Wraith Blades, and you can also use it on Wraith Lords. As long as it's a core unit, you can use it. So unfortunately, you cannot use it on a Wraith Knight, and you can't use it on the Hemlock Wraith Fighter. So even though I do think this is decent, I don't think it's that outstanding, and I definitely don't think it's good enough to be qualified as a great faction-specific stratagem. I think the other Craftworlds have much better faction-specific stratagems, including the Saim Hann, which we're going to also talk about in this video, and this just really doesn't stand out to me all that much. Alright, so moving on to the Saim Hann. So for their army bonus, they get to reroll charge rolls, which is really good. I think this is a pretty good trait, right? And it kind of makes sense. It kind of fits with the theme of the Saim Hann being the Wildhost. However, it's with their second part of the army bonus that I kind of start to think that, well, it's not so great, right? So units can basically fall back and charge in the same turn. Now, typically, with the kind of units you're going to run with Saim Hann, it's just not that great, right? Shining Spears, Howling Banshees, Striking Scorpions, all of those units tend to kill their targets on charge and don't really have a chance to fall back afterward. So again, this is something that on paper looks kind of good, but in reality, the units you're going to be using are not going to be in a position to fall back very often. As for the relic, you have the Talisman of Tino Char, which is a pretty decent relic. It gives +1 strength and -1 AP, but it's really only useful against opponents that are toughness 6 or higher. And the AP is nice, but it's, again, only useful against units with a 2+ armor save and no invul save, right? Because you are going to be using this on a Saim Hann model, and let's be honest, you're not going to be putting this on a Farseer, okay? You're going to be putting it on an Autarch, probably. And in a Saim Hann list, at least most of the time, you're going to be running that Autarch on a jet bike. So the Laser Lance already has AP 4, or -4, I should say. So having AP -5 just versus 4 really isn't that useful in most cases. And again, the +1 strength on a already strength 6 weapon is only going to help you against toughness 6 targets or higher. But again, it is decent. It does make your Autark hit a fair bit harder. And I do like using Autarks in the Samhain. I actually use 2 in my Samhain list. You know, in Arks of Omen, I pay the extra command point for the other one because they're just really good bullets that can just kind of charge into enemy units, kill them, and then make good trades. And then we also have the Warlord trait, which gives +1 attack. So again, that's not bad. And it also gives you heroic interventions within 6 inches instead of within 3 inches. And that's pretty useful, right? As if you're running an Autark with Shining Spears tend to have large base sizes, and this can sometimes prevent a normal heroic intervention from taking place, right? So having that extra 3 inches when charging in with Shining Spears, and for the turn after when the Shining Spears maybe get, countercharged, is actually pretty useful for helping your Autark get into combat. And as for the Samhain stratagem, Warriors of the Raging Winds, I think this is just awesome. Basically, it allows Samhain biker units to advance and charge. It's only 1, but remember, Samhain biker unit includes an Autark on a bike. It includes Shining Spears. And it also includes, believe it or not, Wind Riders. I know that seems really weird that you would want to do this with Wind Riders, but actually, if you need to tie something up or get onto an objective, it can be pretty useful if you are running Wind Riders in this type of list. Now, I personally didn't run Wind Riders in the Samhain lists that I played with, but, you could go with Wind Riders. Wind Riders are a very viable option for this list type as well. So basically, seeing as jet bikes auto-advance 6 inches, that gives them a 30-inch threat range before you consider Ghost Walk and Strands of Fate. This means that you can potentially get turn 1 charges with Autarks on jet bikes and Shining Spears, which is pretty massive. Because if you think about it, having the ability to charge an opponent turn 1 is going to mess with your opponent's deployment considerably. Now, he or she is going to have to worry about deploying correctly so that they don't get charged turn 1. And that immediately is going to hand you control of the board in the early game, which is absolutely great. So I think this is probably one of the best stratagems just in general because of that ability. And honestly, Shining Spears are no joke. If you can get a squad in there turn 1, whatever unit you hit is going to bite the dust hard. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about what units work best with each Craftworld. For Iyanden, I think the best units are Wraithguard and Wraithblades. So I know that kind of seems weird that I'd put them on this list considering that the army bonus doesn't really help them out a lot, but the relic helps them immensely, and the fact that it's Iyanden just means that you do want tough units on the field that can weather some fire. So they benefit greatly from the relic. The stratagem is also beneficial to them a bit, and the army bonus does help them a little bit as well. Also, Guardians and Rangers get a slight durability boost for their cost, and a very slight boost to combat attrition tests, which, to be honest with you, on Rangers isn't that important, but for big units of Guardians, it's pretty decent, right? Having the ability to basically save some of your models when you do take a morale check or fail a morale check is a good way to kind of keep your Guardians in the game for longer. And especially since the kind of weapons that are going to be shooting at Rangers and Guardians are most likely going to have that AP -1, AP -2 that the mini Armor of Contempt is going to help with, right? So the army bonus actually does benefit those units considerably. And lastly, Shroud Runners are pretty durable as well with the army bonus, and they cover Wraith's weaknesses. So Wraiths are really bad at dealing with a massive amount of enemy horde units, and Shroud Runners cover that weakness really nicely. Shroud Runners are also really great at preventing charges with their stratagem and also just body blocking in general. They can take out hordes, and of course they're very quick and easy to maneuver, which helps out the Wraiths because Wraiths are generally extremely slow. As for the Samhain, of course, the star unit there is Shining Spears, which are extremely strong with the stratagem and army trait to reroll charges. And again, these guys can pretty reliably, almost guaranteed, get charges off on turn 1, especially if you factor in Strands of Fate and Ghost Walk. They're going to get to the units they want to get to pretty quickly. Autarchs on jet bikes are also extremely powerful as well. They are very good at trading, and with the Relic and Warlord trait as well, they can do considerable damage. And I actually run 2 of them for an extra command point just because they're so effective in the Saim Hann list, and they have so much threat range that if you keep them around until the late game, with the right combination of relics, they can actually be a potent objective stealing force as well. And I actually think the Sunstorm relic is a really good relic for the Saim Hann as well, because now instead of a 30-inch threat range, you're getting a 34-inch threat range because of the Sunstorm relic giving you a additional plus 4 inches to your movement. And then lastly, Vipers are also very good in the Saim Hann list just because of the fact that they can force enemies into bad positions, they can capture objectives, and of course they can tie up enemy units. And especially with the reroll to charge, this is very useful. And this is also one of the few units that actually gets a benefit out of being able to fall back and then charge, because if you do charge this thing into something like a Space Marine Tactical Squad, it's probably going to survive, and it's probably going to survive long enough to be able to fall back. Okay, so now that we've kind of gone over all the traits, relics, and stuff like that, and basically what units are best with each Craftworld, why are these 2 Craftworlds not performing anywhere close to the others in Arks of Omen? And I think a lot of us can pretty much already answer that question. It's because both have really subpar army bonuses. So when we talk about army bonuses, by the way, in 9th edition in general, are extremely important to how effective the units in your army can be, right? And both the Saim Hann and Iyanden just don't have strong army traits to back up their units. The Saim Hann, for example, goes way too hard into Shining Spears, and arguably, the Biel-Tan runs them better anyway, as far as damage at least goes, along with all Aspect Warriors. And that's on top of having a single reroll for each unit, which is very powerful, and the ability, of course, to get guaranteed battle focus rolls and advance rolls. Iyanden's bonuses, on the other hand, don't really help with Wraith units all that much, especially when compared with Uthway traits or the traits of the Farfall and Craftworlds. So essentially, Uthway runs Wraithguard and Wraith units better than Iyanden. And on top of that, Uthway also gets to reroll wounds per unit, and they also get better psychic powers, which of course psychic powers are a key factor to keeping Wraith units alive in a game. So again, you have the Craftworld that is meant for psychic prowess being better at running Wraith units than the Wraith Craftworld. It doesn't really sit right? And honestly, it really shouldn't be that way. Saim Hann should be much better at running jet bike units in general, not just Shining Spears. And of course, Iyanden should be much better at running Wraith units than Craftworld Uthway, right? But despite this, I still think you can build a successful and strong list with each Craftworld. So I think the key to building a strong list with each of these Craftworlds is basically as follows. So first, you have to focus on the core of your list being the strongest units for that Craftworld, obviously, and build the rest of the list based on units that support them the best. So for example, when you're talking about Iyanden running Wraith units, and that would be the Wraith Guard and the Wraith Blades. So what units support those models, right? Well, Shroud Runners are very good at supporting, Rangers are very good at supporting those models. So basically fast elements that are able to cover the weaknesses of the Wraith Guard and Wraith Blades. For the Saim Hann, of course, the best unit is Shining Spears and Autarch Skyrunners, and what units support those the best? Well, in my experience, those would be units that are fast and can pin down enemy positions or pin down enemy units so that your Shining Spears or your Autarchs on jet bikes can get better targets to charge in and kill. Okay, so I want to go ahead and show you the 2 lists that I've been playing with the Iyanden and the Saim Hann, and kind of go through them and give you a quick breakdown and analysis of each one. So for the Saim Hann, for our HQ, we have an Autarch Skyrunner with Laser Lance and the Talisman of Tino Char. That comes in at 105 points, and it costs 1 command point for the relic. We also just have an Autarch Skyrunner with the Laser Lance, just base. That also costs 1 command point, because of the basically detachment rule that allows you to take 2 autarchs in the same detachment. So basically the plan with the autarchs is just to use them as missiles. So their sole purpose in these games is to hit units and make good trades, right? Because they do a lot of damage. We also have 2 Farseer Skyrunners. One has Guide and Fateful Divergence for those extra command points. And of course, Guide is just very useful in general as a damage multiplier. And we also have another Farseer Skyrunner with Ghost Walk and Doom. Again, Doom is a great damage multiplier, and then Ghost Walk helps our units get better charges. For our troops, we have 2 units of Rangers. These are basically to perform anti-advanced deployment duties, so they're going to be battling against other advanced deployment units to get better positions on the battlefield, and also just to screen and do general objective work. Then we also have 5 Corsair Void Reavers with Power Swords. So this is a unit that I just kind of had extra points for and decided to just throw in reserve. And honestly, they did pretty good. They don't require a whole lot of investment. You can kind of just put them in reserve and then have them come in on turn 3 and try to take something out. And it just kind of gives your enemy a cheap thing to have to worry about in the backfield. For our elites, we have 3 Warlock Skyrunners. One has Jinx and Protect. One has Quicken and Restrain, and then one has Enhance and Drain. So I like Enhance and Drain in this list because it really helps units like the Autarch Skyrunner and the Shining Spears get better trades against the enemy's tougher targets. So normally Autarchs hit on 2+, but if your enemy has anything that gives you a -1 to hit, this will still allow your Autarch to trade effectively, and same goes for the Shining Spears. Again, hitting on 3+ versus 2+ is a big improvement. However, if you don't need to use Enhance, you can always use this Warlock Skyrunner for psychic secondary objectives, including Warp Ritual and things like that. We also have a unit of 5 Striking Scorpions. The Exarch has the Biting Blade and Crushing Blows, and this is just to set up Alpha Strike opportunities. Again, this is just something that opponents do have to respond to. And it also puts a lot of pressure on your opponent to start moving forward and use more screening units and play more defensively, which plays right into the strengths of the Saim Hann, being able to essentially charge from 30+ inches out. For our fast attack, this is the bread and butter of the list. We have 5 Shining Spears. The Exarch has the Expert Lancers Exarch power. So this unit is basically a hammer, right? This unit goes in hard, takes out the most expensive unit in the enemy army, and then unfortunately is probably going to die, right? But it is a very hard-hitting unit, and it does trade up against a lot of different targets. So it's really good against big units of Terminators, for example, because basically these guys are going to be hitting on 2+ and wounding on 3+, especially if you have Guide and Doom on this unit, or Doom on the enemy unit, I should say. This unit is going to be hitting like an absolute truck. We also have 3 Shining Spears, the Exarch having a Paragon Saber and the Heart Strike Exarch power for those mortal wounds. That comes in at 125, and this unit is more of a trading unit. It wants to trade with other small units and be able to do mortal damage against units with high Imble and armor saves. In addition to those, we also have 3 Vipers with Scatter Lasers, and their job is basically just to flank the enemy, pin enemy units in position so that our Shining Spears can come in and clean up. And lastly, for our heavy support, we have 3 units of Warwalkers, all with Bright Lances, 2 units of 2, which are going to be advanced deploying and helping perform Alpha Strikes and trying to blow up enemy transports so that our Shining Spears can get into the goods. And then lastly, we do have a unit of 3, which is probably going to be hanging out in the backfield, popping shots, and then fire and fading into obscuring terrain. So the general idea behind this list is to put a lot of pressure on the opponent. Basically a pseudo Alpha Strike. You have units like Warwalkers, Striking Scorpions, and Shining Spears. They can all threaten enemy units from turn 1. And this puts a lot of pressure on your enemy and puts them on the back foot from the beginning of the game. Then from there, you can kind of control the battlefield how you like, use Vipers to tie up enemy units, and make it very hard for your opponent to actually be able to do what they want to do in the game. Alrighty, so moving on to the Iyanden list that I've been running. For our HQ, we have a Farseer on foot with the Citronome of Iyanden, Fortune, and Doom. We have a Farseer on foot with Guide and Fateful Divergence. Both of these Farseers are going to be in Wave Serpents accompanying Wraithblades. And we also have the Avatar of Cain. I really just couldn't resist putting the Avatar of Cain in this list because we did have Fortune in this list, and the Avatar of Cain is an absolute world beater when backed up with Fortune and gives you a really strong combat presence. For our troops, we have only one unit of Rangers just because we do need something to prevent enemies from using advanced positions on us and getting the jump on us with different units. And also, Rangers are pretty good just for screening in general. We also have 3 units of Wraithblades and Wraithguard, 2 units of Wraithblades with Ghost Axe and Force Shield to hold the line and be basically an anchor to the rest of our force. And we have a unit of Wraithguard with these sights. So these guys' job is to basically use Webway Strike to come in and kill whatever the Wraithblades cannot deal with. So any big threats on the battlefield that do a lot of damage that can get through the Wraithblades, the Wraithguard are meant to just deal with that unit and get rid of them. Especially with Guide and Doom, that unit will be destroyed utterly. We have a Warlock with Protect and Jinx to reduce armor, and we have 2 Warlock Skyrunners with the Quick and Restrain combination to score on Warp Ritual. And we also just have Conceal Reveal because, well, Conceal Reveal is just a good thing to have in a tough list like this. For our fast attack, we have 2 units of 3 Shroud Runners to score on things like behind enemy lines, and also to provide support for our Wraith units, because of course Wraith units aren't good at dealing with hordes, and Shroud Runners are excellent at it. So we have 2 units of those, and we also have 2 Vipers for general screening duties, and also to score on objectives and things like that. And lastly, for our dedicated transports, we have 2 Wave Serpents. One has a Twin Bright Lance just because I did need a little bit of extra anti-tank in this list. It is something that is lacking from the list in general. And we have a Wave Serpent with a Twin Scatter Laser, and that brings us to 2,000 points. And basically this list is designed to be very tough and provide a very hard nut to crack for enemy armies. You have 2 units of Wraithblades with Force Shields and Ghost Axes in Wave Serpents, which are pretty hard to take out for most opponents. You have the Avatar of Cain, which honestly a lot of armies out there cannot deal with effectively, especially under the effects of Fortune. And lastly, we do have units that can support that main anchor with speed, hard-hitting shooting, and of course, really superior objective play. So in this list, we do have access to the Warp Ritual, which is pretty easy to get off fairly easily throughout the course of the game. We have the ability to score on things like Line Breaker, and lastly, with the Avatar of Cain, we can easily score on things like Grind Them Down, which, you know, because we have units that are very tough to kill, makes sense in an army like this. So, in conclusion, Iyanden and Saim Hann, although really fun and awesome Craftworlds, are not in a great spot competitively in Arks of Omen and can probably use a buff to bring them in line with other Craftworlds, which I think is a real shame, right? I think these are 2 of the most iconic Craftworlds, and it's a real shame that the 9th edition Codex didn't really give them the rules that they deserved. On the other hand, though, if you really lean into their strengths, which are pretty few, but if you do lean into their strengths and use units that can effectively support those key elements, you will have a lot more success with them. So leaning into units that can really support Wraithguard and Wraithblades, for example, will really help an Iyanden list do much better. Units like Shroud Runners, Rangers, and things like that help an Iyanden list perform much better. And yes, you could go lore friendly and you could just do a pure Wraith army, which is awesome. You know, thematically, that's a very cool army. But is it the most competitive? Is it the best army to pick and revolve around? Probably not, right? It has a lot of weaknesses, and especially on Iyanden, you'd be much better off running that kind of list in Uthway or a custom far-flung Craftworld. And as for the Saim Hann, if you can pick up units to support your Shining Spears that hold enemies in place, and also put a lot of early pressure on enemy units so that they are forced to react, you will have much more success than just spamming Shining Spears and Wind Riders. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. We have a couple more videos coming out later this week. I have a video coming up on how to fight Dark Angels, which are the most competitive army in 40K right now. And let me tell you, they are very strong. I've had a couple more games with my Dark Angels buddy who, is on our local gaming group, just busted out his Dark Angels after having him in a box for a very long time. And he is really enjoying how OP they are. Luckily, I think with Craftworld Eldar, we have a lot of tools, especially if you're using a Harlequin patrol, of dealing with Deathwing and Ravenwing elements of a Dark Angels army. We also have a video coming up on flyers. I want to cover the Craftworld Eldar flyers again, both the Hemlock Wraithfighter and the Crimson Hunter, and just kind of talk about where they are currently in the state of the game, which in general is not good, but I do think there are some ways that we can use them effectively. And we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. I'm going to go ahead and leave the Patreon and PayPal links in the description for those of you who want to support the channel further. Thank you so much for doing that once again. I really appreciate all the support that you guys have given me and this channel. All right, everybody, peace out. See you guys next time. Have a great couple of games this week if you do get the chance to play at your local game store or tournament or whatever you guys are going to do. And I will see you guys in the next video. Peace out, everybody. See you later.